guns, gangs, and violence. Welcome to this special edition of Sidewalk Skyline Podcast. We're in a series called Gangland Preachers. The last episode was with Olu Jegede, pastor of Christian Center Church in the Jane-Finch corridor of Toronto. Today, we're going to hear part one of an interview with Dr. Anthony Hutchinson. We're going to hear about his early formation as a gangbanger in Vancouver, and Tony's story is truly remarkable as he journeyed out of those early years into a life of incredible purpose. Dr. Hutchinson is a leading gang expert who specializes in developing and evaluating youth gang prevention programs and presents nationally on anti-gang and gang exit strategies. Dr. Hutchinson is often consulted on matters related to positive youth development, positive youth identity formulation, music as an intervention to positive youth development, and innovative entrepreneurial development and social enterprise opportunities for at-risk youth. He is currently the department head and program chair in Health and Human Services at Tyndall University as an assistant professor at the school. Dr. Hutchinson teaches undergraduate level courses in sociology, social work, social policy, and developmental psychology. Previously, Dr. Hutchinson has held a range of teaching and master's thesis supervision, external reviewer posts for universities in British Columbia and Ontario, including Royal Roads University, the University of Toronto, McMaster University, and Wilfrid Laurier. Well, that's just scratching the surface of the things that Tony has been involved in. He also has a practice as a psychotherapist. After this interview, keep on listening. I'm going to come back and I'm going to share some observations that Tony gave me this week about the effect of pandemic restrictions on crime in Canada. So let's go now to my interview of Dr. Tony Hutchinson, and this was recorded earlier this year at the Mission Canada office in Mississauga. Dr. Hutchinson, I want to focus on your experiences from childhood and young adulthood, primarily in two cities, Vancouver and Toronto. I had the chance to read some of your bio, and I recognized you shouldn't have survived those years, except for some divine intervention that started something new at work in you. So I want you to take me back to Vancouver, where you were born and raised. You had to deal with a lot of darkness right from the beginning. Take us back to the intensity of your childhood.
Well, it's a pleasure to be sitting here with you this morning, Kevin. And I think I want to preface this by, as much as we all have our own unique stories, and everybody, one of us. But the reality is, I think every person shouldn't be here. And every person is born into a life of darkness. It's the nature of who we are as humanity. And so then it becomes, I guess, why do we all have our stories? And you know, we think back to the Bible that said if they could take every account that Jesus had, they wouldn't have been able to fill up. They would take up so many volumes of pages, you know. And so I think going back to being born in Vancouver and how that occurred. And how I found myself in my own, let's call it darkness. It becomes a product of what it means just to be human and what it means to be born into this fallen state, this fallen world. And we could even be born to good Christian parents, and we know that kids can, you know, fall apart, go astray.
Yeah.
And but the reality is, I wasn't necessarily born into a household of let's say good Christian parents at the time. You know, I was essentially I was born into chaos,
Mm-hmm.
and so then when you're born into chaos, and you're born into fragmentation and despair and these aspects of what it means to be human, it sets a trajectory, and then the question is, what is that trajectory, and why is that trajectory meant to be?
Mm-hmm.
And we can just say, well, we're born into misery, we're going to be plagued by a life of misery. Or maybe we can say, well, we can say maybe some new age philosophy or something like this. Well, we're born that so we can overcome and show,
Right.
how we overcome. But I guess over my life, I always believed that ultimately I came to a point where I believe that the ultimate purpose is that we're here for God's purpose and His glory, and I began to cling to that, even though I never really understood why. And there were definitely seeds along the journey that maybe we can talk about, but there's a Bible verse that says, "I knew you from before you were born."
What a comfort.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think it's in Jeremiah,
Mm-hmm.
I believe. And so while you were in your mother's womb, I had planned your life, and we can talk about things like predestination and all these theological concepts, but I don't even get into that. I just believe that because anybody who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I really believe, but there, it's always there. It's always open.
Mm-hmm.
And so the door is always there, and we just have to walk through it. And so I guess for me, I did make a decision when I was relatively young to walk through that door.
Mm-hmm.
And there's another verse that says, if you're young and you learn the truth, or you're molded in a certain way, when you get old, you're not going to depart from it.
Right.
And so I find there's a lot. So if anything, I see my life as when my book is published, you just alluded to my book, but when it's published, every chapter actually starts off with it's a secular book,
Mm-hmm.
but it starts off with a Bible verse.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I start each chapter with this Bible verse, and because it seems like, if anything, my life has always been not because of me, but in spite of me.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not because I always walk away from God.
Yeah.
And I'm always unfaithful to God, but He never walks away from me.
Yeah.
And He's never unfaithful to me.
Yeah.
And but again, you don't, like Paul says, you don't keep pushing that and trying that and
Right.
tempting that.
Right.
Just because grace or mercy abound, do I keep being a reckless sinner or something like
When
that?
did your awareness of God begin in childhood?
It's interesting. So my dad was a sailor.
Mm-hmm.
My dad came from a very interesting background, and I don't want to go too much into it. A lot of the stuff will be in my book, so I don't want to give too much of a spoiler. But my dad came from a really interesting background, and there was a lot of very intriguing components and parts to him, but there was a lot of tragedy in his past as well. He left home at 15.
Mm.
And he essentially lied about his age. He was of half Spanish descent and then partially Scottish and Nigerian background through the Caribbean.
Mm-hmm.
Migrations through the Caribbean of Scots and Nigerians. But and his family came from La Coruña, Spain, and again migrated through the Caribbean. And he was born, and but he went through a lot of abuse as a kid, and in the island of Trinidad, and he ended up joining the. At that point, Trinidad was still a British colony, so he had a British passport. So he joined the British Merchant Marines just towards the end of World War II. But he lied about his age. He said he was 18. He was actually 15. But they didn't check in those days.
Yeah.
So he spends the next, he finished off the war, Royal Merchant Marines, and then got onto the British oil tankers, BP, and then he moved into the Greek oil tankers, and traveled the world. And he was essentially raised by sailors for the next 25 years, quarter of a century. So from the time he was 15 till the time he was 40, he essentially was raised by sailors. And if you describe him as a pirate, that would be quite accurate. And he ends up, my mom, who actually was part Arawak Indian, indigenous to Venezuela, and South Asian from Indian ancestry, again, island of Trinidad. She ended up being a fair-skinned lady, very fair-skinned, didn't take after her siblings, who were all quite dark. And she ended up moving to Vancouver, becoming a school teacher in the 50s. And she went through a lot of tragedy in her own life, sexual assaults, betrayals by her family and things like this. From her very first child that she had was kidnapped and taken out internationally at the age of 3. And so she had a lot of tragedy in her own life. And in 1966, my dad came into Port of Vancouver with his ship at the time, and he just, through happenstance, met my mom. And my mom, interesting. My dad was essentially raised Roman Catholic, of Spanish ancestry and so forth. My mom was, her mother was an orphaned girl, and she grew up in an Anglican convent. But my mom's family was essentially Hindu. But my mom's mother, because she was raised in this Anglican orphanage, used to do some of the Anglican teachings with my mom when she was growing up. And so my mom kind of had to walk these two lines of Hinduism and Anglicanism. And so, but by the time, my mom and dad met in 1966 in the Port of Vancouver, February 1966, my dad was taken aback that he meets this lady from Trinidad.
Yeah.
Like 8,000 kilometers away. And so, one thing led to another, and they end up, I ended up being born about a year later. They were married, and I was born a year later.
And your dad continued.
And he got off the
sailing.
No, he started to go. He set port. Of course, he never told my mom that he had a wife and a family in Greece. Okay, so
the inconvenient truth.
There you go. Yeah, and so again, this just this is kind of, so again, my life is starting in chaos. I discovered that I was born in April 1967. My parents were married in March of 1967. So if you do the math, I was born out, a month after they were married.
In a day when that was very much looked down upon.
There you go, right? And so it was so that and so the seeds of faith. Look, at the end of the day, at a very hyper kind of superficial level, my dad was Catholic. My mom had an inclination of Anglicanism. And so we ended up kind of going to the Anglican church throughout my early years at a superficial level. Again, especially at that CNE, the Christmas and Easter phenomenon. And growing up, I was born and raised in Vancouver, Canada, and so. But I how you're a kid and you kind of find church kind of boring, and so I didn't really resonate with what I was getting. But one thing I did know is I liked the stories in Sunday school as a young child. I liked these stories, and we learned about Adam and Eve, and I remember when I was 4 or 5 years old, we learned about Adam and Eve. Now, take into account that my home life was very tumultuous, and my dad became an abusive drunk, and there was a lot of family violence, and my mom had bipolar, and so that was tough. I also grew up with a lot of racism in Vancouver,
Mm-hmm.
because at that time it wasn't very diverse, and
Yeah.
I have a mixed background, and interestingly enough, my dad was passed as Caucasian.
Mm-hmm.
He was very fair skinned. My mom was relatively fair skinned.
Mm-hmm.
But I ended up, and for the first 3 years of my life, I essentially was very fair skinned.
Yeah.
And then around the age of 4, my skin started darkening
Yeah.
because of my mom's genetics,
Yeah.
and maybe even my dad's. And my dad's like, well, one thing I didn't tell you is my dad was inherently racist.
Wow.
So I began to get this rejection from him
Hmm.
because I was getting dark.
Wow.
And that was really tough. Anyway, but then, in Sunday school, you'd get these messages that God created in Anglican Sunday school. We got these, God created all people equally. He loves
Yeah.
everybody.
Yeah.
We're all one humanity, kind of, we're all children of God.
Yeah.
Because that was the one prayer that they always would say, you're all God's children.
But you still had the white people flannelgraph?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was interesting. So the seeds were planted in probably Anglican Church Sunday school,
Mm-hmm.
and so I never want to downplay the importance of early childhood engagement in Sunday school.
Mm-hmm.
I think, and so anybody who's a Sunday school teacher, I think, is one of the most important functions people can do in the church. And we always treat it almost like it's a glorified daycare. Let's get the kids out so they don't distract the church service.
Yeah.
But I think that people who serve in Sunday schools should be the foundation of our churches. Not the appendage.
Right.
Because it's those we don't know the power of those early seeds.
Yeah.
And the best scientific evidence shows the most critical years of life for every single human being, from a social determinants of health perspective, is the first 6 years.
Yeah.
And so if we got our kids, in Sunday school, from the time they're 3 to 6, and I honestly believe that's what happened to me. I think those seeds were planted.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then it began to get more intricate as I grew, of course, like with anybody. But those first 6 years, so as much as I had the chaos of my life with my mom and my dad, family violence, alcohol abuse, all kinds of messed up sexual things were going on in my family as well. As much as I had that, there was this time where on Sunday mornings for 45 minutes,
You got a break from all that.
you did, yeah.
Yeah.
And so you became aware that there was this entity, this presence, this kind of omniscient, omnipotent being that could possibly intervene. And so the philosophical question for you as a kid is like, well, how do I connect to that?
Yeah.
How do I? Yeah. And
I think
was a driver for me.
most people, when they think about, their childhood, their upbringing, at the time, you feel like I'm living a normal life. And then as you start to get older and into adult years, you start to look back and say, wait a second, some things were off. Did you feel like even though you had all this chaos, did it feel normal to you?
No, it never felt normal.
Never felt normal.
It never felt
It was
normal.
exceptional.
Because I saw other kids that seemed happy.
Yeah.
And I saw other kids that seemed to have nice parents.
Yeah.
Were
you unhappy?
You know what? Like, it went back and forth.
Yeah.
It went back and forth. But again, I got to give my mom credit for taking us to Sunday school. At time, and again, it wasn't even that frequent.
Yeah.
And so it's the idea of the novel.
Yeah.
The right. So we didn't go every week.
Yeah.
We would go periodically. And so when you only get some things periodically, you appreciate it more.
Right. It didn't get overly familiar where you could just dismiss it out of mind.
Yeah. And so, and of course on TV too, there would be these little TV shows like Davy and Goliath.
Yeah.
I don't remember who made those, but I would just watch these things on Sunday mornings, and they
Yeah.
just would have an incredible impact. And
Yeah.
and for some reason I would be mesmerized with them even more than I don't know, the Planet of the Apes or Spider-Man cartoons.
Yeah. Yeah.
So anyway,
So there was an interest in the moral tale right from an early age, wasn't there?
I think there was, because there were certain things that happened to me, sexual violations that occurred with me around my parents when I was a kid, and I knew they were more wrong.
Yeah.
But so again, I think it goes back to the point. I think there's some things that we inherently know are wrong.
Yeah.
And we know that things aren't normal, but you're right, people begin to just acclimatize to it.
Yeah.
But I think the big thing that really began to impact me more than anything was actually more than likely racism, because it was in grade 1 where I was happy. I think at that point I was relatively okay. Struggles and stuff. I went through, my parents essentially separated when I was 3. My dad took off and went back to his family in Greece for 2 years. He came back when I was 5, and then there was a whole bunch of violence between him and my mother over the next few years, and then things kind of settled down. I ended up in grade 1, and I'm in the bathroom in my school, and a kid comes up to me and goes, "Hey, why are you so dark?" And I'm like, I don't know. And he says, maybe, I said, I was just maybe playing in the dirt and I got dirty. Yeah. And he's like, oh, well, yeah, maybe if you wash yourself here in the bathroom really good, you can get yourself clean.
Wow.
And then that year I realized I couldn't see in the school very well, so I didn't want to get in trouble from the teacher, and I was the only brown kid in my school, I think at that point, and so I would make stuff up. So they would say, well, what's on the board? And there could be numbers, they could be pictures, and I would just go like, just look at number 4, and I go, oh, it's a car, because I couldn't see.
Yeah.
And so I just made, so they go, something's wrong with this kid, he's like, and so basically they called the social worker. She did some testing on me, and I just learned to just try to give people responses they wanted, because if you didn't do that, you got beat at home, right? So you just gave people the responses you think they want.
Yeah.
So that way you won't get in trouble.
Yeah.
And so she tested me, and they go, there's something wrong with this kid. So they sent me to the school board head office, and I get tested by a psychologist. And the psychologist concludes, PhD, clinical psychologist. This is why I don't have a lot of respect for psychology and stuff.
Even though you are one.
Well, yeah, well, I'm a doctor of psychosocial clinical practice, but it's the same training. And they concluded I was mentally retarded.
Wow.
And so all of a sudden you got this clinical psychological diagnosis that you're mentally retarded.
Yeah.
And that label's now going to stick with me for the rest of my school years, by the way.
Yeah.
Wow. But what happens is my mom wouldn't accept that. So she took me to the family doctor. And this just goes to the pride of clinical people. She takes me to my family doctor. He comprehensively tests me, even though the psychologist comprehensively tested me.
Right.
And he goes, your son has essentially elongated eyeballs, which are creating a vision impairment and a significant myopia, or I can't see distance. Yeah. And he's going to have to wear very thick glasses.
Wow.
Coke bottle glasses at that time. And that fixed my ability to see.
Yeah.
And I wasn't retarded anymore.
Yeah. Wow.
But the issue was the school board won't take back their diagnosis.
Oh my goodness.
Right?
Yeah.
So now, but it creates another scenario. So now I'm labeled mentally retarded, which sticks, because this school board psychologist will never admit he made a mistake.
Yeah.
That I just labeled a kid who just couldn't see.
You were cluster bombed with rejection.
Yeah. And my father, and now the school board psychologist, and then now, but now the other kind of thing was I had to wear these really thick glasses, Coke bottle. So now my nickname became you're a racialized kid, now you're called Four-Eyed Freak.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so all of a sudden this begins going on, and so that begins following you through for your next school years, and so it seemed like, the cards were really being stacked up against me. And then, I really kind of struggled in school. I went to a different school. My mom was a school teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And single mom.
Mm-hmm.
So she was always trying to figure out ways for people to take care of us, move us to schools where we had daycare. And so I was moving from school to school, sometimes twice in a year.
Yeah.
And
so you never developed a deep sense of community there.
Or friendships or anything,
Yeah.
And so for the first 8 years of my life, again, chaos, no firm foundations. It was crazy. And I just remember having to create my own realities to survive. But my best friend was television.
Yeah.
I was essentially raised on Happy Days and Sesame Street and different TV shows, right? And that became my reality. And I became a latchkey kid from the time I was 6 years old. And I had to raise myself, and I was like, I remember being sick as a child, having to stay home, grade 7 and 8 years old, staying home alone by myself while my mom went to work because I couldn't go to school because I was sick.
Yeah.
And one other thing, when I was a little kid, I had these ears, really big ears that used to stick straight out like Dumbo.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember my doctor, because he was a very kind man, and he said to my mom, he goes, your son's this kid's has a lot of, he was perceptive enough. He was a Jewish doctor. He was perceptive enough to understand rejection because he had a Jewish history.
Yeah.
And he basically said, we should actually, I'm concerned that kids are going to make fun of him because of his ears. So they did an operation. It was at that point, it was new, relatively speaking, where they pinned back the ears.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that created, and so for the first day, and my whole head wrapped up in bandages after that, like a turban, and so, but again, otherwise that would just have been another problem. But it was tough. And then of course my mom, single mom, lonely, wanted to have a man in her life, and she, at that point, she meets my husband, not my husband, her husband.
Yeah.
So at that point, my mom, she's a lonely single mother. She wanted to meet, a guy. So she met this fellow school teacher, a dark-skinned Indian guy from Trinidad. Mm-hmm. The argument is she had an affair with him some years earlier while she was still with my father, and actually was pregnant with my sister.
Wow.
This is a story that my godmother later told me in later life, which is why a lot of the chaos happened with my dad, because all of a sudden the intimate life between my dad and my mom wasn't that great, and all of a sudden she's pregnant.
Yeah.
So my dad was a little bit upset.
I guess he would be.
And so maybe that's what created some of the turmoil. But anyway, so she ends up with this guy, and he was a high school biology and sciences teacher, and he proceeds to beat me every single day for every morning for close to the next 8 years, off and on. Got less as I got older, but he would still, that's how he'd wake me up every morning. I'd be sleeping, and the guy would just come into my room, but what he would do, my mom would go get up in the morning, go into the shower. And the shower would start, and we were living in a house at one point where I could actually see directly cross into my sister's bedroom. Mm-hmm. So he would get up, he would go into my sister's bedroom, hang out in there with her for half an hour, and I could see what was going on. Mm-hmm. And as soon as the shower would go off, and then he would leave her bedroom, come into my bedroom, and beat me to wake me up.
Wow.
And this is what my life was.
Yeah.
Meanwhile at school, I was getting grade 3, grade 4, grade 5. I was arrested for the first time when I was in grade 3.
Grade 3.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I needed attention or something. I don't know what I needed, and I figured if I gave some nice things to some of the other kids at school, they'd be nice to me. And so I went to a store and stole a bunch of stuff. I got away with it.
Yeah.
But I guess they somehow caught me on security camera or something and figured out I was at that local school, and the people showed up, the police, and
wow.
And they're like, yeah, we saw that you stole a bunch of stuff, and and now of course you're in grade 3. They're not gonna, So
Yeah,
I just got a lot.
didn't throw you in the slammer.
No, but I got in my mom beat the tar out of me when I got home that night.
Mm-hmm. There's a John Steinbeck in East of Eden, a book he wrote, published in 1952. There's a couple quotes that talk about rejection, and that book was all kind of built around the premise of Cain and Abel, contextualized into the States. But listen to this quote here. And as a few strokes on the nose will make a puppy head shy, so a few rebuffs will make a boy shy all over. But whereas a puppy will cringe away or roll on its back groveling, a little boy may cover his shyness with nonchalance, with bravado, or with secrecy. And once a boy has suffered rejection, he will find rejection even where it does not exist, or worse, he will drop forth from people simply by expecting it.
That's a powerful, powerful quote, because, not that this has happened to me per se, but I guess I do it in other ways. But there's examples of children that are physically abused by their parent. Mm-hmm. And they get to the point where if they've done something wrong or they're going to get in trouble, they pull out their own hair, or they will smash their own head against the wall.
Because you don't need to do this to me. I'll take care of it.
And I think that became maybe what I did. I began to punish myself in all kinds of adverse coping ways throughout my growth. But the reality is, the Bible, God, whatever man intentions for evil does God use for good. And the stepfather, who was a horrible, horrible man, he's still alive today, but still just wants nothing to do with me. He knows his guilt. And again, he stayed with my mom for the next grade 3 to grade 12, so 9-10 years before they finally got divorced, and that he became very violent too. But in a nutshell, he grew up in the south of Trinidad in a place called Princetown. And there was this little Muslim girl whose father was an imam that he went to school with. And I guess he remembered her from those days, I don't know. But he somehow connected with her in Vancouver. But little did he know that this Muslim girl, who was the daughter of an imam, had become a very influential, well-known evangelical woman Pentecostal leader.
Wow.
So what happened is there at the time, I guess in the 60s, there was a evangelical Pentecostal Christian faith kind of leader named Mary Goddard, who had a kind of a healing ministry. She was also associated with people like Chuck Smith from the Calvary Chapel movement and that kind of thing. But she again, where especially with strong women leadership began occurring in the States, and more that was affiliated more with the Assemblies of God in the States, and then out of her ministry came this. I meant it was Catherine Kuhlman.
Oh, Catherine Kuhlman.
It was Catherine Kuhlman. Sorry, yeah. So Catherine Kuhlman was Catherine Kuhlman through the kind of the Assemblies of God faith ministry across the United States became a really pronounced leader, and she mentored a lady named Mary Goddard. I guess she was a fellow American.
Who was the daughter of the imam?
No. So Mary Goddard became another influential woman, she became the mentor for this Muslim woman.
Oh, okay.
So just kind of, it was just, so she was basically, so you started with Catherine Kuhlman, then you go this lady called Mary Goddard, and then this lady Shayna.
Okay.
And Shayna, and so my stepfather did not know that his former classmate had become this evangelical woman with a powerful women's teaching ministry and a healing ministry. And so by so my mom and stepfather were married in 1976, And by 77, my mom was diagnosed with a severe degenerative disc disease in her neck and in her spinal structure, where her bones were essentially disintegrating.
Wow.
And all these medical specialists gave her about 2 years to live, maximum. He says, so they said, you need to make provisions for your children. And now, take into account, I got this stepfather who's horrible.
Yeah.
My father was still a raging alcoholic. We'd see him on the weekends, and we'd go there, and I'd get trapped in the bedroom where I slept with my sister, while he'd be raging drunk, running around naked in the living room, and then wanting to beat us and molest her and all kinds of things. And so it was just chaos all over the place. There was no safe place for us in terms of parents. And now, and then, the parent that's supposed to be taking care of you is now, got a death notice. So my mom was introduced to this Shane Mohip by my stepfather, the same guy who was horrible. But then my mom she moved from kind of the superficial Anglicanism, where we still go occasionally. Our stepfather wanted nothing to do with any kind of Christian religion, and my mom started going to these Bible studies and prayer meetings, and then in that she basically had a miraculous healing and complete restoration of her neck.
Wow.
Proven by x-rays and 3 medical specialists in the city of Vancouver, all independent. And so when she went to a prayer meeting, and she left it, and as she was driving away, she kind of heard these pops in her neck, and she claimed the healing, and they couldn't explain it. Like they declared it a miracle, and
love it.
And these were like science-based specialist doctors, and there were 3 reports, all independent.
This wasn't somebody who was delusional and in denial. This was documented. This was unbelievable.
And I remember having to see my mom. She'd sit there for hours with her neck in traction in the bedroom, and all kind of going to physio, and when her teaching career was over, her life was over, and she had this miraculous healing, and so of course the next thing of course we're going to Pentecostal churches, and we're going to Bible studies and all this. And then my mom took me to Mary Goddard when I was 12, 11 or 12. I can't remember, 11 or 12. And Mary Goddard prophesied over me. And at that point, Mary Goddard, and she said all of these things. Like, she said things that nobody could know about me. And she also said God had certain plans for me, but I was going to be like a rebel and a mule along the way. And I was like, okay, whatever. But I remember, and I remember one thing I remember about Mary Goddard, she was a cool lady, right? She was like and so I grew up under the kind of the strong woman guidership of the Shane Mohip, my mom's friend, and there were some other strong women leaders who I grew up under. But after that, by the time the abuse was still going on with my stepfather at home and all that kind of stuff, and he hated the fact that my mom became a Christian, a born again Christian. He just and of course one of the things is the minute that born again Christianity sometimes plays out in people's lives, it doesn't get better, it gets worse. And that's what happened in my house. If it wasn't, we jumped out of the fire into the frying pan. And my mom just, and it was, every day was a fight. Every day was an argument. It was violent. But my mom just kept going back, because remember, she had this miraculous healing. Yeah. That's all she knew. Yeah. And so she had to stick with that. And so she just drew more. And I remember she'd listen to, the radio, Christian radio. And so I grew up around that. But then, the influences of high school, I was still being teased. I was still labeled.
Yeah, you're still carrying around a lot of rejection, right?
Yeah, and so basically what ended up happening, people still made fun of me for my glasses and the fact that I was not white, and racism continued at school, and so finally one day I was walking through a Canadian Tire, and there was they had a display case where they basically had a .22 handgun.
A .22.
.22.
Yeah.
And it was there.
How old were you?
I would have been about 14.
About 14, okay. Yeah.
And I was able to steal it.
Hmm.
And I took it to metalwork. I was in grade 9 at the time at Caribou High School, and I modified it
In shop class.
to shoot rounds, to shoot bullets.
Wow.
And that was, and then eventually I got another one.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really funny because, the kids were making fun of me one day, and I remember some kid was making fun. I think at that point, again, drug dealing we started doing marijuana, drug dealing. You're around that age, and and that's how you make money.
Yeah.
So I had to make money, and I was afraid of getting beaten up. People not taking me seriously. So the gun seemed to be an interesting way of protecting it. But I remember these kids were laughing at me.
Interesting conversation starter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And some kids were laughing at me, and I remember I just pulled out my gun, pointed at them, and they stopped laughing.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that as long as I had this thing, I had power.
Mm-hmm.
And it got to the point where sometimes you had to use it to get a little bit of respect from somebody.
Yeah.
If you shot somebody and they died, it wasn't your fault; it was their fault.
Mm-hmm.
They shouldn't have teased you.
Yeah.
You didn't sit there and you reached the point where you weren't remorseful or sad about it. These people brought this on themselves. They shouldn't have disrespected you or something. But I guess at that point I was pretty angry about certain things in life. Even though my mom, it was healed, she didn't. Eventually, over time, my mom began to focus more on the healing than the healer.
Mm-hmm.
That was the thing about my mom.
Right. Right.
That was a big problem with her. She kept, and so I think we have a testimony, and we have to move beyond our testimony.
Right. Right.
It's our testimonies are really there for God, not for us.
A sign of the kingdom is on the road of life.
Yeah.
But you don't say, okay, I'm going to live here at the sign.
Mm-hmm.
You follow the sign to where it's leading.
Yeah. And so again, it was just part of my mom's, I guess, one of her own Achilles heels. But by 14, I was getting in full-fledged, we can call it kind of gang activity, some bad kids. We were, now they call it a gang.
Yeah.
Back then, look, we were a bunch of kids. We stole stuff. We sold it.
Yeah.
We dealt drugs. We came from the same neighborhood, same high school.
Semi-organized crime.
Well, I had guns.
Yeah.
If there was a Korean store, we could rob it.
Yeah.
It was fun. You point a gun at somebody and they listen to you.
Mm-hmm.
I get that kind of thing. And you think you're tough. You think you're cool. And we're doing a lot of really tough, cool, bad things.
Yeah.
But then I liked a girl around Valentine's Day in grade 9, and I decided to go to a local Woolco and steal some nice presents for her. Mm-hmm. So I stole a Valentine's chocolate in a heart. I stole some CDs because music, and I stole a pair of girls' jeans. Mm-hmm. But now take into account, if you're a bad kid, you're dealing drugs, you're trying to vandalize cars, you're robbing stores, you're doing other. I got busted for shoplifting.
Nice.
Yeah. And the crazy thing is, when they busted me, I had a pair of women's jeans or girls' jeans strapped around my waist. So it was just the antithesis of getting arrested for something so non-cool.
Yeah.
And I remember I
you had to maybe embellish the story when you told, but.
Because you want to like I was in a takedown or something, but it wasn't that glorious, And anyway, to make a long story short, I ended up getting a probation officer, and he ended up being a Christian.
Well, that's quite a story, isn't it? You don't want to miss part 2 of this interview. We'll be back on May 15th with part 2. Isn't it amazing how God can use people to affect great change in young lives? The Tony Hutchinson story could have been one that ended in tragedy, but the gospel is for broken people that need love, people that need healing, people that need purposeful correction. So I asked Tony the other day, what kind of impacts are you noting around crime and crime statistics in Canada at this time of pandemic restrictions? He said it's a little hard to get the read because of some of the mitigating factors, but here's some observations. First of all, in terms of the levels of crime, overall crime rates are down. But this is partially because police are arresting people less due to the risk of COVID-19 upon police officers. Police are giving out fines in parks for people that are breaking the social distancing rules. Domestic violence has been reported on the rise as people are in closed quarters at home. However, the murder rates are reported as stable. Car thefts are reportedly up. With more empty roads and people at home, speeding and stunt driving is up. DUIs, on the other hand, are down because there are fewer people that are out drinking and then driving home drunk. There have been reported break-and-enters into some businesses that have inadequate security systems, and drug crime arrests are reportedly way down. Police actions. Police are arresting fewer people, as I mentioned, due to the risk of COVID-19 to police officers. And in the U.S., there are numerous police officer deaths due to COVID-19. And in the courts are backed up, and prolonged delays to have charges heard in court. It was already bad in that regard, but COVID-19 has just exacerbated the court and the court process. And then in jails, inmates in some cases are getting sick from COVID-19, and because of that, those who have minor nonviolent charges are securing earlier release dates. There are guards that are getting sick with COVID-19. Isn't it interesting how all of this is having an effect on literally everyone? Let's remember to pray for frontline workers today, including police, including correctional officers, and all those who daily put their lives on the line. Well, I'm looking forward to hearing part 2 of this episode. I hope you are too, when we come back on May 15th with Dr. Anthony Hutchinson. That wraps up our episode for today. So until next time, keep one ear to the sky and one ear to the ground in your city. I'm Kevin Rogers, and you've been listening to Sidewalk Skyline Podcast.